Welcome everyone. Today we're going to talk about Chapter 12. We're going to focus on the spinal cord, the spinal nerve, and spinal reflexes. And here's a basic diagram of our brain and spinal cord and how they work together. The main job of the spinal cord is to send information either to or from your brain. And it's very highly organized. Not all the information from your spinal cord actually gets to your brain. Only about 1% of the sensory information gets to your brain. And that's so only the most important information gets to your brain. If all the information got to your brain, something like this would happen. Okay, so in that movie, he could hear what women wanted, and so he had all these voices inside his head, and that made him go crazy. That's what would happen to you if your nervous system wasn't so highly organized. And we should know the two basic functions of the spinal cord are communication and reflexes. The spinal cord has 31 pairs of spinal nerves, as you can see here, and they're named basically after the vertebrae which they lead from. So the first 8 are cervical, then we have thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and 1 coccygeal. If we look at a cross-section of the spinal cord like this, we'll see it's made up of white matter and gray matter. The white matter is myelinated axons, and the gray matter is mostly cell bodies and dendrites. The spinal cord is protected first by the bone, then by the meninges. There's 3 layers to the meninges, and also cerebrospinal fluid. And the 3 layers, the outer layer is the dura mater, the middle layer is the arachnoid matter, and then the inner layer is the pia matter. And if we look at this, dura mater, arachnoid matter, and pia matter, and in this space here is where you would have the cerebrospinal fluid. And the cerebrospinal fluid is formed in the brain, and it circulates, it goes down the middle of the spinal cord and around the spinal cord. The CSF protects. It also circulates nutrients, chemical messengers, and wastes. This figure shows the denticulate ligaments, which hold the spinal cord in place. They keep it from moving side to side. And in the gray matter integrates, and the white matter communicates. If we look at this figure right here, it's showing someone getting a lumbar puncture, or sometimes it's called a spinal tap. And they would do this to get a sample of your cerebrospinal fluid. So if we look back at this figure, cerebrospinal fluid goes around the brain and the spinal cord. And if they take it at this level, the spinal cord is ended. So they're getting just a sample of the cerebrospinal fluid, and that will tell them about the conditions in your brain. Alright, if we look at the cross-section of the spinal cord, the posterior half, towards the back, is going to be sensory, and the anterior half is motor. And if we look at these figures, it will tell us here's motor nuclei for the somatic muscles, here's for visceral things, and sensory for visceral and somatic. And you don't need to memorize all these diagrams, but this shows, like, here's where this is going to be sensation from the leg, from the hip, from the trunk, from the arm, and here's where motor information is going to the trunk, the shoulder, the arm, the forearm, the hand, etc. So just know that it's very highly organized. This is a spinal nerve, and It looks sort of like a muscle. It's arranged into fascicles, just like a muscle was, and it has connective tissue coverings, just like a muscle does. And the covering around a whole muscle is called the epimysium. The covering around a nerve is called the epineurium. And then the covering around one fascicle is called the perineurium. And then around each individual neuron or axon, you have the endoneurium. And the nerves monitor specific regions called dermatomes. This is a dermatome map. And it's not exactly like this. There is some overlap between dermatomes. And this is a person with shingles. Shingles infects one of your motor neurons. And by looking at this and mapping it up with our dermatome map, we can find out which. So it's probably one of these here. It's one of those nerves right there that's affected by the shingles. And if you had, for example, numbness to this region, we would suspect there's problems with the nerve that goes to this region. Okay, and these spinal nerves, some of them form groups called plexuses. There's a couple plexuses you should know. This is showing the cervical plexus, which innervates the head. One of its most important nerves is right here, the phrenic nerve, which goes down and innervates the diaphragm. The diaphragm is your main muscle for breathing. Then this is the brachial plexus, which innervates the pectoral girdle, the arm, and the hands. And then the lumbar and the sacral plexuses innervate the trunk and the legs. Next thing we're going to talk about are reflexes. And reflexes are rapid, they are automatic, and they are responses. So a reflex is a rapid automatic response. That's the simplest definition I can come up with. And you need to know the parts of a reflex arc. So here's a simple withdrawal reflex that helps protect us from painful stimulus. So the first step is a receptor. We've got to have a receptor to detect the pain. Then the second part is a sensory neuron, because we have to have something to send the signal from the receptor to the central nervous system. And in the central nervous system we will have an integration center, or an interneuron. In this case it's an interneuron. Sometimes it's just a synapse, but the integration center is the third part of a reflex arc. And then that is going to send some type of signal to a motor neuron. So a motor neuron is the next thing you need. And then the last part of a reflex arc is the effector, and in this case it's a skeletal muscle. Here's another neuron, or another reflex. This is the knee-jerk reflex that probably everyone is familiar with. But before that, reflexes can be classified back a couple different things by their development. They can be innate, that means we're born with it, such as the withdrawal reflexes for pain, or it can be acquired, things like walking. It can be also characterized by the nature of the response. A somatic reflex is going to involve skeletal muscles. There are also autonomic reflexes, which would involve smooth muscles and glands. They can be classified by their complexity. They can be either monosynaptic, like this one you see here, just one synapse, or this one here has more than one synapse, so it would be polysynaptic. They can also be classified by the processing site. The processing site could be in the spine, in the spinal cord, or it could be up in the brain. So there are spinal or cranial reflexes. The stretch reflex is monosynaptic, and it involves muscle spindles. Right in here you have a muscle spindle. Here's a close-up on the muscle spindle. It measures the stretch of this muscle, and we don't want our muscles to stretch too much or they will tear and break. And here's what the muscle spindle does. So when it gets stretched, it sends an increased frequency of action potentials. When it's at the resting length, it sends this normal frequency. When it gets compressed, it decreases the frequency. So this is one way we know the stretch of our muscles. So this is the flexor reflex, which is another withdrawal reflex. Standing up straight involves many postural reflexes, many stretch reflexes. The cross extensor and withdrawal reflexes are polysynaptic, so we can see more than one synapse. This is polysynaptic. And here's the cross extensor reflex, and again we can see several synapses, so it's polysynaptic. We need to know the properties of polysynaptic reflexes. First, they involve pools of neurons. So there are several interneurons involved. Next is that they are intersegmental, which means they are all along the spinal cord. They involve several different regions of the spinal cord. They involve reciprocal inhibition. So like we saw here, it's going to stimulate this muscle and inhibit the opposite muscle. That's reciprocal inhibition. And several reflexes may cooperate to produce a coordinated, controlled response, like walking. Another thing that reflexes are useful for is to determine the location and the severity of damage to the central nervous system. So here's some different reflexes that can be tested. This is called the Babinski reflex, or the Babinski sign. And if you do this to a baby, their toes fan out. So again, Babinski sign, you do this to a baby, their toes fan out. If you do this to an adult, the toes curl. And if an adult's toes curl, that's a sign of some kind of nerve damage somewhere. So you might see them doing this to someone who's lying on a football field and they're unsure if he's paralyzed or not. And this Babinski sign can also tell you when a baby's about to walk. As soon as their toes start to curl, that means they're about to walk. And that means the connections from their brain down to their toes have finally developed. The abdominal reflex is another one. This chart tells several reflexes and what the normal response is. So if you have an abnormal response, that would, for example, if flexion at the toe joints was not happening, that would be maybe damage to the tibial nerve. And that's chapter 12.